Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. And today we enter 2007 and we look at the launch of FSOLDigital with the first 3 volumes of From the Archives, all released on the 19th of March 2007. From the Archives, Volume 1. FSOLDigital is the electronic brain made reality. It gives us the freedom to do whatever we want, when we want. No 3-month wait to get the campaign together, no A&R guy telling you to go off and write a hit before it's released, etc, etc. Gaz in Freeze magazine. Almost exactly 10 years of the day of the previous proper FSOL release, the band launched FSOLDigital. Didn't come entirely out of the blue. The archive tracks on MySpace the previous year and played on Electric Brainstorm's 0.5 were mentioned in the Barcode magazine interview in late 2006, with Gaz saying, "You hear tracks from our archive basically that have been unreleased, so we're probably thinking about putting out an archive album as well." So it's clear that new releases were just around the corner and that they would include an archive album. But what people weren't expecting was a website with 10 albums of unheard material. The site is the kind of thing they were talking about in interviews long before the technology even existed to make it possible, particularly this incredibly prescient comment from Gaz talking to The Guardian in 1994. There will come a time when we can process information quicker and send it out on the internet to whoever wants it. We'll be able to do away with record companies and with the existing distribution systems which keep them in power. We'll be able to send our whole audiovisual product straight to the consumer. Alongside collections by New Aliases, Heads of Agreement, Polemical and Part Submerged, plus the long-awaited Z-Box record, and as well as a gigantic globular burst of Anti-Static and a tiny point of light covered in the last video, were 3 albums entitled From the Archives Volumes 1 to 3. This is where most fan attention was drawn, perhaps unsurprisingly given how much material was released. A rough idea of what could be released as archives was drawn up several years before in the form of a set of in-house CDRs called Fish Smoking, adorned with a photo of a dead fish with a cigarette in its mouth. A large number of these tracks ended up on the first 3 From the Archives volumes, but they remained an in-house project, one of the countless potential ideas, most of which are never realised. Then 2 things happened. A couple of hard drives died, losing sessions of old work, and the band started to put together teachings from the electronic brain and were looking for what interesting material could be on it. Realising they had dozens of excellent tracks available, a discussion was had on how they could be released. The initial suggestion was to pass them to Virgin for potential release by that label, or added as a bonus disc to teachings from the electronic brain. Brian, however, pushed for self-releasing the tracks, believing there would be a potential audience out there. Eventually it was decided to test the waters and release them as digital downloads to see if that fan interest was enough to sustain a website. While digital stores such as iTunes and 7Digital were at their peak at this point, artists running their own independent download sites were still few and far between, and FSOLDigital was pretty forward thinking for its time. Admittedly, their site itself could have been less buggy, no pun intended, with the 123 music store software growing more unreliable as time went on. Eventually no orders came in the email and you had to send an email off to the band's management to actually get what you bought, and the site itself designed in Flash by Brian, using some slightly dated animated GIF style art. Still, in March 2007 it was quite an amazing thing. Actually somehow discovered by Getafix, who posted a link on the very quiet FSOL list before Graham from the band's management even had the chance to make the official announcement on the FSOL board. It was the start of an era that flipped the previous 10 years' dearth of new material on its head. As for the music itself, the first volume is a mixture of tracks previously known from ISDN transmissions, tracks with familiar samples, and totally unheard stuff. Opening with Lizard Crawl, a MySpace track that proved immediately very popular with fans, and the early version of Yage, now renamed Hallucination, there then follows 15 more tracks of unreleased 90s pieces. There was, unsurprisingly, some disappointment at the lack of links between the tracks, especially as several environments are present as standalone pieces in their own right, and the generally jumbled nature of the pieces running from pre-Life Forms ambient techno to 1997 psychedelic material. The project initially being very much an experiment, however, means that these issues hadn't really been thought about too much really. At this point it was literally a case of little more than here are some old tracks if anyone's interested. Among the fully fleshed out, soon-to-be classics and environments, there are also pieces that feel less fully formed, such as Neurodevice Send. All in all, for hardcore fans, these early releases were exciting, both as fascinating peeks into the group's history and for the numerous gems contained within. For casual fans, they were judged less favourably, with many mixed reviews and ratings found online. I believe they want to buy music they like, so give them the option to be able to. Make it available to everyone at the same time via digital and bring the physical release along afterward. No one and everyone is special in that way. We still believe in the physical format. I want to own and hold an album in my hands. I want to look at the artwork and see how it reflects in music. I want to read the liner notes. Good albums are an immersion for the senses. Garry again in the Freeze magazine interview. 10 days after the launch of the site, the albums were revealed to be coming out on CD in July of the same year. A few complained, justifiably, of having to double dip, but generally the decision was met with positivity, especially the concept of having proper new FSOL physical releases again. Although hopes of the albums being fully mixed with environments were dashed, the CDs featured one exciting development: the return of Buggy G Riphead. The initial digital releases featured fairly basic artwork, but after more than a decade since his last work on an FSOL release, Bugs was back in the fold, going through the image archives and putting together new collages for the albums. Volume 1 features the iconic Lifeforms gatefold picture of Shawneen with the jellyfish over the wireframe image from the ISDN inner art, a blend of older imagery reflecting the blend of old tracks. The booklet includes further iconic FSOL imagery, including Vit's face, Shawneen with Spiky, as well as an inverted version of the Tales of Ephedrina back cover and landscape photography. Much in the manner of the Dead Cities book, Buggy's last job with the band, text and logos are collaged throughout the booklet, including a logo stating Broken Sky in both English and Japanese, and the EBV logo. Also included is a very fractured story by Gaz in an attempt to link up the album's 17 track titles in some kind of narrative. Unsurprisingly, it's not very successful, although the first-person approach and general weirdness feels incredibly FSOL. Far from the pavement psychology once so beloved of the headhunter who had arrived one pale moon with a neuro device send. Well, quite. Pleasingly, phrases like pavement psychology, the title of an image in the Lifeform CD booklet as well as a still unreleased track, and the electronic brain tie in with the world building of the 90s era, as well as new terms such as cellular memory, yes at first a glitch, which will pop up again in the coming years. The disc art and tray introduced further new staples such as the exploding head FSOLdigital.com logo on both the disc and back cover, the wireframe of Spiky's body on the disc itself, a cracked Earth photo under the disc, and the rear layout. This last in particular would go on to become part of the early FSOL digital identity, with track titles listed down the right hand side, credits written vertically on the left, and a pixelated shot of Shawneen in the background. The EBV logo plus electronic brain violence legend is displayed prominently on the back cover. All text is, thankfully, in Eurostyle extended. Interestingly, at this point the tracks were published by Westbury, the company who handled the original Humanoid material. The biggest surprise at the time was the label. The band had reconnected with Passion Music and resurrected the Jumpin' and Pumpin' name and catalogue number system in the process. Having been burned by numerous larger labels in the intervening years, relations with Passion and its lovable barrel boy owner Les had smoothed over with time, and they forged a deal for the label to license FSOL digital releases for physical distribution. On the 13th of February 2012, new versions of the first 3 from the archives releases were distributed to some digital stores in enhanced editions featuring environments linking all the tracks together. Remarkably, these have yet to appear on FSOL Digital or the FSOL Bandcamp page. Volume 1 is the only one of these that comes close to feeling like a proper FSOL journey, with the somewhat random track selections prohibiting too much consistency though. Lizard Crawl. Possibly the one track to feature most frequently on FSOL releases, Lizard Crawl is a hugely popular piece. First heard in 2006 as archived 0027 on the FSOL MySpace, it went on to be the very first track in the From the Archive series. Sharing the same bass sounds as We Have Explosive Part 3, it's extremely likely this piece was recorded in or around the Dead Cities era, which might explain why it was never released on an official album, as its laid-back pastoral vibe is very much at odds with the themes the band were exploring at that point. Opening with gentle beats, which are joined by pretty synth arpeggios and funk bass, which on paper shouldn't work but somehow really does, the track soon breaks down to a beautiful piano melody and wordless vocal sample. It's an uncharacteristically simple piece of music, more minimal than one would normally expect from the band, with the Dead Cities approach being of complexity put into the gradually growing beats rather than layers of samples, but even structurally it merely has one breakdown in the middle rather than the usual to and fro meandering. This works in the track's favour, however, letting the beautiful melodies do the talking. Not only very popular among fans, the track seems to be a favourite of the band's too, appearing on both 2007 From the Archives adjacent releases, as well as the 2008 and 2012 FSOLDigital sampler mix and archived environmental views in 2017, and in an alternate mix as library music track Bubble and Peak. Quite remarkable for a piece that never once had an outing on a transmission in the 90s. The 2007 version isn't linked to other tracks. For the 2012 enhanced version From the Archives, a synth environment links it to the following track. For archive environmental views, it closes with a 30-second environment featuring thunder, rainfall and doors closing. An edited version opens FSOLDigital mix with 46 seconds of Globular and closes with a brief Dead Cities Tour environment. Hallucination. The earliest known piece in the evolution of Yage, Hallucination first appeared in the 1995 John Peel session before going on to be a live staple of the 96-97 ISDN tour. Built around a fast jazzy breakbeat, repetitions of the Yage flute and Simon Wells's chugging guitar chords, it's a raw, intense slice of the darker and heavier side of the band, a remarkable contrast to the previous track, especially given they both seem to be linked to these same album sessions. The track builds to a noisy crescendo before cutting back to silence, and then an entirely separate guitar outro takes over, reminiscent of 60s spy themes. For its appearance on the enhanced version of From the Archives Volume 1, an outro environment was added, which itself would be released as No Man's Land on Environments 4. The original release in March 2007 came briefly labelled as Ayahuasca. This name, the proper name as the drug, also known as Yage, would be reused for an alternate mix of the track on Yage 2019. The second digital release named it Hallucinations. Field of Flowers. Some archive tracks are easy to place, others much less so. Field of Flowers falls very much in the latter camp, starting with gated voice samples. It could easily be one of the more pastoral pieces from Lifeforms, but the chopped up breakbeats feel much closer to Dead Cities, while the guitar samples bring it closer to ISDN's sound. That said, live transmissions and archive tracks have over the years proven that a broad range of tracks and sounds were created for each album, and it was in the album curation that the particular stylistic and thematic cohesion came together, rather than each record starting with a specific mood in mind. If I was pressed to put a date on Field of Flowers, I'd place it between ISDN and Dead Cities, concurrent with tracks on the Art Futuro transmission, but I could be way off, it could be 93. The track is led by a bright melody and gated vocals, although there are regular atmospheric breaks with added gentle percussion, and it features the classic FSOL structure of numerous elements appearing in different combinations throughout, meaning there's comparatively little repetition. The 2007 version features an outro environment of numerous bizarre samples and field recordings that close the piece on a much darker tone. This is cut shorter for the enhanced version by crossfading into the following track. It was originally named Field of Flower on its first digital release, and also turned up on the Mushroom 11 soundtrack on the Underground level in a 2-minute edit. Environment's Birds, also known as Environment F1. A brief environment of whooshing sounds, including bird samples, that was used extensively throughout the 1993 Kiss FM transmissions and 94 3D Headspace tour, as well as appearing from time to time on later transmissions. The 2012 Enhanced Edition features an additional 30 seconds of environments with layers of laughter and what sounds like a mournful flute melody, closing with seashore samples. Initially called Environment F1 on the first digital release. Still Flowers. The booming bass drum and bright sampled melodies place Still Flowers firmly in Lifeforms territory on their own. The sample of a man saying "ill flower" cements it. A fast-paced rhythm built from odd samples as well as drum machines drives the track with jazzy trumpet melodies and warm synth chords, making a particularly upbeat piece. As ever, there are numerous diversions over the course of the 5-minute runtime, including a completely new half-tempo rhythm section being added in the final minute. Gaz once described the early Lifeform sessions as containing bouncy Balearic tracks that didn't quite capture where they wanted to go with the record, and Still Flowers sounds like it could easily be one of those. For the 2012 enhanced version, a dark dramatic closing environment is added with minor key synth chords, electronic whooshes and a Dilruba melody, which all feels a little overbearing after such a light piece. Environment's Gong, also known as Environment's G1. Titled Environment G1 on the initial download release and one of the oldest pieces in the FSOL catalogue, this Kraftwerk sampling environment of gongs, flutes and coughing voices dates to 1990 or possibly earlier, its first appearance being part of the Art Sense Technology track Isus Flow Vast Galaxy remix. It appeared regularly in 93 and 94 transmissions under the name Isus Environment before finally being released as a standalone track in 2007. The 2012 Enhanced Edition features synth chords from the previous track and a second environment to close with birdsong and vocal chanting. This also appears in Electric Brainstorm 7. Woodland. also known as the Woodlands. First heard on the 94 Essential Mix, this Lifeforms era track is an intriguing blend of styles. The drums are built from odd samples, drum machines and acoustic percussion, giving the track an odd mix of ambient techno and breakbeat sounds. The melodies are largely bright and synthetic, but with occasional edgier, jazzy samples and melancholic vocals. First heard in 2006 on the band's MySpace page as Archived 0011 and appeared a few months later prior to its release on Electric Brainstorm's 0.5. Seemingly popular with the band and fans, is a strange one that I've never fully engaged with myself. The enhanced edition adds no environment, simply snappingly cutting straight to the following track. The very first digital release was tagged The Woodlands, UU. A brief Dead Cities era environment of digital noise. No additions were made for the enhanced version, it's simply being used as a linking environment in its own right. Turnaround. Undoubtedly one of the highlights of the initial From the Archives releases, Turnaround is a Lifeforms era track that really should have been on that album. Utilising the same distorted guitar, saxophone, field recordings, NASA samples and synth pad as Among Myselves, as well as a rhythmic loop from the Lifeforms single, it's very heavily tied to the album but works remarkably as its own piece. An epic 7-minute track built around multiple layers of thick synth chords and acoustic percussion. It feels very grand in a way many FSOL tracks don't, having more in common with their Virgin era remixes than the bulk of their original tracks. Throughout the piece, the usual array of samples are triggered, adding to the dense texture, and unusually a synth solo and electric guitar improvisation lead much of the piece. A stunning piece of music and one of my all-time FSOL favourites, the kind of track that makes me glad for the From the Archives series, even at a point when the albums were a little patchy. The 2012 Enhanced Edition crossfades straight into the following track. Is This Real? A 96-97 tour environment featuring the dense layers of whooshing, clattering sounds used throughout those broadcasts. Used on the bulk of the shows of the tour, including the one that was released as ISDN show. The environment is named after the vocal samples, a man asking is this real and a woman answering does it matter. The enhanced version crossfades with its surrounding tracks. Mouth Muse. An unusual track, almost certainly from the Dead Cities sessions due to its dark mood and beat complexity. An IDM piece with beatbox sounding samples, glitchy noise, a strange screaming sound and sampled percussion all combining to make the intensely dense rhythm track that leads the piece. As with a lot of Dead Cities outtakes, it feels perhaps a little underdeveloped, lasting little more than 2 minutes with comparatively little in the way of melody. Tracks like this lend much more credence to the dark, aggressive sound Gaz complained of that album than the record itself. The 2012 Enhanced Edition uses the same environment later found on Environments 4, linking Murmuration and Sunsets. Hazy Day Girl. Utilising guitar samples used in a number of Dead Cities tracks, Hazy Day Girl is clearly from these sessions for that 1996 album. It opens with a beautiful melody played on tuned metallic percussion and strings, creating an incredibly melancholic mood. A brighter guitar melody enters before the feel changes dramatically with the appearance of a harsh, fast-paced IDM beat. Strangely, the beat cuts out after a mere 40 seconds. A beautiful track, but one that feels oddly unfinished due to the brief appearance of the strange beatwork. The 2012 Enhanced Edition adds reverb and delay to the end, allowing it to cross-fade with the next piece. Wet Pavement, also known as Wet Pavement. A lo-fi field recording of footsteps and rain that was first heard on the 1994 VPRO transmission. The initial download release was labelled Wet Pavement, the later version and CD oddly changing it to Wood Pavement, possibly a typo. Headhunter, a 1997 track and part of the series of pieces that led to the start of the ISNES, bizarrely via We Have Explosive and Papua New Guinea. We Have Explosive Part 4 evolved into Implosive, which then led into Headhunter, then Sendora Luminosa, and finally the Peel Session version of The Shining Path, the final 3 featuring numerous elements of Papua New Guinea, including chimes, synth sweeps, and in this case what sounds like a single note of Lisa Gerrard's voice. The deep bass line and pounding drums later feature on the versions of The Shining Path, while the funky wah-wah guitar, very much a 1997 FSOL sound, remains exclusive to this particular track. But surprisingly little variation over the track's 7-minute runtime, giving the impression of a work in progress as much as a completed track. The run of related pieces seems to bear this out. I once spoke to Brian about it and he described it as ISDN fodder. The 2012 Enhanced version adds a closing environment of utterly weird sounds, low spoken voices, organs, reversed skronking saxophones. Arrived, also known as Sitting Around. First heard on the 1996 transmissions, including the one that was released as ISDN show in live form with the working title Sitting Around, Arrived is one of those rare beasts, a Dead Cities era ambient track. warm synth chords, squelching 303 lines, gentle percussion hits, and the usual FSOL sweeps and whooshes. It's a very beautiful piece, but clearly not suited to the mood of its parent album at all. Saxophone notes lead into the piece's outro. The ending is fed through a huge delay box and faded into a weird closing environment on 2012's enhanced editions, with an engine starting and synth notes fed through a huge phaser. Pale Moon. Almost certainly an ISDN era track, Pale Moon is pitch black in atmosphere with chugging, slightly lo-fi hip-hop drum beats, jazzy muted trumpet solo, and a menacing guitar loop. Dark synth and wind chime samples run throughout in the background, adding to the sense of foreboding. Drum machine glitches add variety in the second half. Even more full of foreboding than most of ISDN itself, the track is one of the least welcoming pieces in the band's catalogue. It's remarkable to think it didn't end up on the album. A tremendous, if bleak, track. The initial download labelled the track Pale Moons. Neuro Device Send, also known as Neuro Send Device. The final track on the first from the Archives release is a strange one, effectively a heavily chopped up and mangled breakbeat track with synth stabs. The strange thing is it doesn't really do much over its 5-minute runtime. I've been especially critical of this track over the years for this very reason. It genuinely sounds unfinished. The inclusion of the extensive closing environment for the 2012 enhanced edition certainly helps, with beautiful melancholic synth melodies and field recordings, but it remains one of my least favourite FSOL pieces. That said, I have found some big fans of the track over the years. The nature of the chopped up breaks suggests it's probably a Dead Cities era track. From the Archives, Volume 2. The second of 3 from the Archives releases that came with the launch of FSOLDigital in March 2007. As for the first, it contains a lot of tracks recorded throughout the 90s with no environments or crossfades linking the pieces, and as such it has a mixed reputation with a number of fantastic tracks on it but no cohesion as an album in its own right and some maybe slightly subpar pieces. In February 2012, the enhanced edition was distributed to the same online stores such as Beatport and Spotify as the other ones, featuring new environments added to make the album gapless, but unlike the first volume, these do very little to add any sense of cohesion, and the album should really be approached with caution for anyone hoping for an individual sound world. That said, track for track, there's plenty to enjoy here, from melodic ambient techno to dark chugging beats, clinical IDM to brief environments, even a bit of daft techno. On first listen, some tracks were familiar from ISDN transmissions, others clearly alternate takes of release tracks, and around half the album completely unheard. Once again, it was released as 192 kilobits a second MP3s in March 2007 and later reissued on CD in July, distributed by Passion and with a jumping and pumping catalogue number. The CD edition is subtly different to the initial download, with the track Mass XXXXX replaced by a shorter edit as Mass XXXXX2. This edit later replaced the original on download editions too. Unlike the first and third volumes, which underwent a fair bit of retitling between the initial release and an update a few weeks later, only Environment Thunder received a changed title at this point from its initial Evil Thunder name. At 21 tracks, it was, at this point, the Future Sound London release with the most individual pieces of music on it. Originally released with a fairly abstract collage as a cover, including elements of the Lifeform single cover image, Boogie was brought on board for the CD version, which oddly features the image used for Volume 1's initial digital cover, a shot of Shawneen being stabbed by one of Spikey's wormhole-making tentacles. It's not the best cover in the band's catalogue, with a very 90s look that hasn't dated too well. Whenever I make that kind of comment on this channel, someone always comes along and mentions Vaporwave, but, Vaporwave is dripping in irony. The inner sleeve is better, opening with a shot of Shawneen underwater, followed by woodland photography, an edited landscape shot previously seen in the Dead Cities 196-page book, a photo of the band, possibly circa 95, a full spiky render, and the photo of the Hume Crescents previously seen on the choked up and smoked up image in the standard Dead Cities art. Once again, these are appended with logos and text. The EBV logo appears twice, once with Electronic Brain Violence, Hole in the Head is written in English and Japanese, Damage is added to the band shot. There's also the first appearance of the Herd Killing logo, including Japanese text saying the same. There's also another story by Gaz attempting to tie the disparate titles into something resembling narrative. It's typically gobbledygook, although the Electronic Brain and Glitch in Memory reappear. The disc, tray image and rear cover all feature identical design to Volume 1, only with purple and yellow shading on the Shawneen picture. Brujo. Despite recording the 2 hours of Frippatronic textures Robert Fripp put down during the Radio 1 live ISDN transmission, only small elements of his performance were ever incorporated into music. The only known track to feature his performance is Brujo, first heard on the 1994 VPRO transmission. Featuring a single Fripp riff with further hints of his twinkling soundscapes, the track is otherwise a fast-paced but mellow ambient IDM piece, lightly clattering drums, 303 squelches, the usual splashes of FSOL sample noise. In the story, The Frippatronic Sound of London and the Big Radio, in the first Ramblings of a Madman book, Gaz explained the outcome of their pickiness when it comes to sampling the great man himself. Several tracks were written, but it took years for them to materialise to the wider public, so that by the time Brujo came out, the moment had passed, and Fripp's slightly sulky, "If Eno can get an album of material out of me, why can't you?" admonishment on the phone several months later fell on the deaf ears of youthful arrogance. For the 2012 enhanced version, a closing environment was added with clicking, water sounds and tense synths. On the FSOLDigital mix edit, the short excerpt opens with mains interrupt. Distant Nebulous, also known as Distant Nebulous. What is a nebulous? Or a nebulous, in fact? On seeing the title, I assumed it was the singular, of which nebula is the plural. Apparently I was wrong and nebula is the single word. Anyway, the gated synths, bouncy, staggered drum loops and sweeping synth chord samples of the track make an excellent soundtrack for something a bit more spacey. It's a relatively simple track by FSOL standards with the usual stop-start, different combination structure, but not really adding any new elements as it goes along. Maybe why it was never included on an album. It's hard to place, with the tone of the synth samples and squelches being very on par with Lifeforms, but the overall programming featuring closer to that of Dead Cities, very similar to Field of Flowers in that sense. One that's set to remain a mystery. By most producer standards, an excellent track, but the slightly underdeveloped nature makes it feel a tiny bit lacking as a Dougans Cobain production, the sort of track you can understand being left off an FSOL album. Wanting. First heard on the VPRO 94 transmission, Wanting is a slice of ISDN-era trip-hop with numerous chunky drum loops, ominous synth melodies, growling bass and sax samples. In true FSOL style, haunting, wordless female vocals are included in the second half. It's hard to work out quite why this wasn't included on the album other than for space reasons. One of the best in this style. Tabla samples from the track would later appear on The End of the World. The 2012 enhanced edition crossfades into the next track. Environment Thunder. Also known as Environment Thunder, Environments Thunder and Evil Thunder. Little more than a field recording of Thunder, previously heard on Through Your Gills I Breathe and First Death in the Family from Dead Cities, with a brief flute melody in the background. An additional environment with reverse samples and synth chords is appended to the 2012 enhanced edition. Cellular Control. One of my favourite from the archive tracks, Cellular Control is a gloriously peaceful slice of ambient techno built around flute loops, gentle percussion and synth strings. It's a fairly minimal piece without so many layers of sound as many of the band's tracks, but it works through the usual range of sections, including percussion-led moments and parts with a bass line at the front. The laid-back feel, flutes and general atmosphere are very 1993 in general, suggesting the track is probably a Lifeforms era recording. Almost none of that album's outtakes make it into ISDN transmissions, meaning it's hard to say for certain. The 2012 enhanced version features birdsong and horse whinnies over the outro. Insected. Despite its name, Insected is only loosely connected with Liquid Insects, sharing only percussive elements with that track. It's stylistically similar, however, as a slice of early 90s experimental techno and was almost certainly recorded during the Tales of Everdrina sessions. Also features a flute sample previously used in Omnipresence and Cascade Part 5, and a piano sample most famously used in Elaborate Burn and Cascade Part 3, as well as a variation on Auto Pimp's synth sequence, giving an idea of how interlinked some of the Everdrina and Lifeform sessions were. Its links to the other tracks are arguably more interesting than the piece itself, which is a brief 3-minute burst of bouncy techno that barely gets going before it ends. The outro environment on the 2012 enhanced version includes sounds most well known for their appearance in Electric Brainstorm 7. Night Lapsed. Acoustic drum loops with some synth notes on top and only 2 minutes long, Night Lapsed is little more than a studio sketch, although one with an enjoyably dark atmosphere. The vibe and jazzy drums immediately suggest ISDN, but it could easily be an earlier piece, bearing some similarity with more experimental tracks from the Jumpin' and Pumpin' era. The 2012 enhanced version crossfades into the next track. Slow of Motion. A Dead Cities tour era environment with a range of dense, garbled layers of sound that typically comes with. Reverse voices and all sorts of odd samples open the piece before thick, warm synth chords take over in the second half. First heard on the 4th FM transmission, the environment featured on most shows of that tour. Headkick. One of the oldest tracks released as part of the From the Archive series, Headkick uses samples heard on two 1990 tracks, Dope Module and She's So Automatic, as well as a drum break later repurposed for 1996's Tiv Fetal. Fast-paced breakbeat with guitar and brass as well as the obligatory vocal samples. It's a fairly simplistic piece but retains a certain fun energy. The 2012 enhanced version simply crossfades into the next track. Dark Matter. A Dead Cities era track with an oddly rolling beat, layers of flutes, synths and breath samples in the background, deep bass notes and reverse samples adding to the sinister vibe. As with a lot of Dead Cities outtakes, it lacks the melodic, melancholic streak of much of the album, focusing on a much darker, more percussion-forward sound. At a little over 2 minutes, it feels a touch incomplete. That said, it appeared several times in 1996 transmissions, starting with the 4th FM broadcast. The 2012 enhanced version features the same closing environment as the vast landscape. Mass XXXXX2. An edit of Mass XXXXX that first appeared on the CD edition of From the Archives Volume 2, and then all digital editions since. The two versions diverge at 2 minutes 32, where this edit jumps to 3 minutes 8 on the original track. Skinny Ribbed Fucker. A daft bit of acid techno with wobbly vocals, probably Gaz, saying process, progress, process, skinny ribbed fucker. It has to be an early track, right? No, it dates from the early Dead City sessions in late 95. God knows why. A closer listen reveals it to be a lot more complex than it seems, with quite a lot of weird samples thrown in at various moments, the rhythm cutting out for one beat to introduce a particular sound at one point. The second half features wordless female vocal samples because, of course it does, it's FSOL. One day they would have been working on Yashica and Through Your Gills I Breathe, and then decided to make this. Just utterly bizarre. Even the 2012 enhanced edition of the album makes no attempt to mix this track into those surrounding it. Fractional Difference. Despite generally going for the band's melodic side a lot of the time, this is one of my favourites. An ISDN era track with all that entails, an oddly choked, claustrophobic feeling and lots of chunky drum loops. Actually feels like 3 or 4 different tracks in there, opening on a really weird paced drum loop in 3/4 with a bizarre synth loop and piano chords sampled from the film Deep Cover, before crashing out into field recordings, then a drum machine playing a 4/4 time with a laughter sample looped on top. Then it's back to the 3/4 drums for a bit, before cutting down to an uplifting piano loop, then a much longer stretch of field recordings. In the middle, the 3/4 drum loop starts and stops after a single bar. Twice. The track generally runs back and forth between various elements, seemingly at random. A woman talks about how one guy was freaking out on acid near the end, followed by some very odd filtered drones. Field recordings, people speaking, bird calls, a car engine are present throughout pretty much the whole track, even over the densest percussive moments. What I love most about this track is I have absolutely no idea how anyone would come up with it, let alone make it. Completely weird and utterly wonderful. The track was first heard on the 94 VPRO transmission, and the 2012 enhanced version loses the final 10 seconds in a crossfade to the following track. Offerings. Very likely to be an ISDN era piece with a solid groove laid down from the main drum loop, wah-wah guitar and water droplet samples, and guitar feedback laid down over the whole piece. Dark, heavy, possibly the closest to rock music created under the FSOL moniker in the 90s. The 2012 enhanced version opens with a brief synth environment. Mains Interrupt. A Dead Cities era environment named after the vocal sample at the start, Mains Interrupt actually includes feedback noises from the opening environment of Dirty Shadows, unusually, before going into a section of ambience with deep percussion and synthy AKS sweeps and gurgles. The second half features recording of an Australian woman talking to a telephone operator about being only able to get through to an answer machine, something which has been used in various eras of the band. The 2012 enhanced edition features a beeping sound effect at the end. Futura. Named after its initial performance as part of the Art Futura transmission in late 95, albeit without the titular vocal sample on the released version, Futura is an early Dead Cities era track. The mid-tempo drum beat and synth loop are the main focus here, with a sample of a synth pad repeatedly triggered. This pad would go on to feature prominently in the between-track environments of the 96-97 ISDN tour. The 2012 enhanced version is extended by a minute through the use of a long closing environment with laughter samples, white noise and field recordings. Museum. A bright bouncy track with lively beats, synth arpeggios, reversed samples and rich layers of electronics. It's quite likely to be one of the earlier Lifeforms era tracks, possibly recorded around the time of Tales of Ephedrina, that was considered too bouncy and Balearic for inclusion on the final album. It certainly has stylistic similarities to, say, Skyscraper. Despite a certain static feel built around these same 2 chords throughout, there's a fair amount of dynamic variation, with the piece building up over the course of its 5 minutes, additional layers and reverb effects added later on to give it an oddly cavernous feel. Nadir. While some of the comments aimed at the early From the Archives releases, that they're just collections of subpar outtakes and unfinished material, are thoroughly unfair, there are some tracks which one can imagine hearing and really not being able to think anything else. Among these is Nadir, a perfectly okay bit of atmospheric breaks with layers of drum loops and wistful notes floating on top, but a strangely unfinished feel and lo-fi sound throughout. The quiet muffled sound just makes it feel unfinished and certainly not up to the band's usual standards. Intriguing then that it made a live appearance as part of the 94 KISS FM transmission, although that mix does actually sound more developed with additional layers. We're Not Here, also known as We're Not Here. A fairly short piece with dark brooding atmosphere, ambient techno beats sampled from God knows where, and a squelching synth melody. It's a relatively simplistic piece by FSOL standards, again probably why it wasn't an album, but what it lacks in complexity it makes up for in mood with a wonderfully nocturnal feel. A voice whispers "We're Not Here" at various points, confirming the title, which has been listed as both We're and Were on various occasions. Were is probably just a typo. Almost certainly a 1993 recording, it could have been an FSOL classic with a little more development. The 2012 enhanced version fades out into a closing environment including a ringing siren-like sound, metallic sounds and birdsong. Mumble. Oddly phased drum loops are the main focus of this very strange track. The emphasis on breakbeats and mangled sax solos makes it likely to be an ISDN era piece. The layers of samples and weird noises over the top of the track are mind-boggling, and the whole piece, the phaser making it sound like the drums are being fed through a blender, is utterly disorienting. It's very clear why it didn't make it onto an album, and it's never going to top any best FSOL tracks polls, but it's certainly an interesting and unique entry to the band's catalogue. Insulin. From the Archives Volume 2 closes on an alternate take of Yage, a track which has been through a number of adaptations and reworkings over the years. The slow piece is built around loose breakbeats, the deep bass notes from the original, a watery synth loop and some mellotron-like chords in the middle. For a time, fans considered this track's existence proof that a Yage single had been planned. It was later revealed that the third Dead City single, however, would have been Glass. At only 2 minutes, it feels very incomplete and exists in a much more satisfying form as part of Yage Rhodesia Insulin, released over a decade later. Mass XXXXX. Dense, complex beat programming here, heading into the kind of no two bars of the same IDM territory as some Warp Records artists working in the late 90s. The track contains both a chopped and triggered breakbeat and a programmed drum machine, adding to the complexity, almost certainly Dead City's era. The first half features layers of synths and effects in the background, giving the track a very spooky vibe. Sadly, this cuts out around the halfway mark, meaning the final 2 minutes feel very skeletal and incomplete. A shorter edit, Mass XXXXX2, replaced this version a few months after release, and frankly it does a good enough job. From the Archives Volume 3. It seemed a really honest way to share some of the hundreds of tracks that have been recorded but not released under the FSOL moniker over the years, Gaz speaking to Resident Advisor in 2009. If anything, the first 3 From the Archives collections, all released on the same day, feel more like one big album than 3, especially if you were there at the time and just tried to take this all in at once. Released as 3 volumes for listening accessibility, there's no real attempt to make any of them feel like individual records, and most will have bought them together on the same day. Without any crossfades or linking environments, they really do feel like one single collection of intriguing and often excellent offcuts with bizarre bits in between. To this day I can only remember which particular volume maybe a third of the tracks come from, and I've come across others who feel the same. Still, of the 3, Volume 3 has some of the absolute highlights, but it's probably the least consistent of them all. At one point, a 1990 hardcore techno track is followed by a slice of proto-Isness electronic psychedelia from 1997. The overall range of the album covers 10 years, the longest of the early archives. Empires, Long Shadows, Space Squids, Rotation and Poppadom are among my favourites here. The release pattern followed that the first 2, a digital release of temporary artwork in March, followed by a Jumpin' and Pumpin' CD in July, complete with buggy artwork. February 2012 saw the release of the enhanced edition on some online platforms. This album features more differences between the versions than the earlier volumes, with 2 tracks, LA7 and Mulek Well, removed entirely from the CD and later digital versions. This was initially believed to be for timing purposes, but both would have fit comfortably on a CD. Stomach Acid was originally listed as Lifeforms Acid, Space Squids as Space Squid, Latronic 1 as Latronc-1, and, amusingly, IA as IAAIAAIA. That was harder to say than you'd imagine. Buggy's cover features an unseen shot of Shawnee kneeling with her arms in the air, Spiky floating overhead. It's a marvellous shot and easily my favourite of the first 3 archives covers. The first page of the booklet features a sickly looking Vit as seen on the original digital cover. The rest of the booklet features a grainy landscape shot, a couple of underpass tunnels, a double page Spiky, a very faint picture of the band, and the Shawnee and Spiky image used later for the Electronic Brainstorm's 0.5 cover. Logos and text this time around include Hot Burst, Neurotic, both in English and Japanese, as well as Electronic Brain Violence EBV, and Spiky attacking a CG figure. The disc, tray image and rear cover all follow the same design as the first 2 volumes with a red and yellow tint to the back. Once again, the track titles are adapted into a nonsense story by Gaz. Empires. Tense sampled synth chords lead this brief piece that opens the third from the Archives collection. Fast-paced, with numerous samples utilised as glitchy beats and with layers of other synths over the top, the track has a sense of urgency about it. Era-wise, it's a very difficult track to place, with a lot of Tales of Ephedrina-esque focus on synth lines, but the Dead City's beats over gurgling samples approach. If I was pushed, I'd put a recording date early 93, but who knows. Not the most developed track, it would probably work very well in the middle of a stylistically consistent record. On its own in a varied archive recording, it feels slightly lacking in places. Long Shadows. A bit of an outlier in the original from the Archives releases, this track comes from 2001. Not what one would expect from the Isness era, but it shows that even at that point they hadn't given up on more typically FSOL sounds. An epic in the Virgin era remixes vein, it's quite a dramatic sounding track built around an acoustic guitar loop and typically FSOL vocal samples with a slow chunky breakbeat. The chopped up electric guitars and sampled piano melodies provide some links to the Morphous sound of the era. It's a gorgeous track and the kind that justifies the existence of the early archives despite their occasional patchy nature. The 2012 Enhanced Edition ends with a rather sinister environment built around the dark repetitive notes and metallic clanging. The 2-minute edit on the FSOLDigital mix closes with a brief clip of Mains Interrupt. Considered. A fast-paced track with a glitchy beat, all signs point this towards being a Dead Cities outtake. The short airy sample acts as a synth pad while the main melody is led by piano sounds. Other than the appearance of a breakbeat at various points throughout, there's very little else to say about this track. It's a very minimal piece, without the band's usual approach of adding new layers and elements as the track goes on. A nice atmosphere is created, but ultimately it's not hard to tell why it wasn't included on an album. A familiar seashore field recording acts as the closing environment on the 2012 Enhanced version. On the initial FSOLDigital release in March 2007, the track ran to 6 minutes 11 with an extended middle section featuring an awkward silence which sounds like an error. This was corrected for the CD and later download versions which run to around 4 minutes 50. Mango Tree. A glorious piece of uplifting guitar-led down-tempo music with jangling metallic percussion and beautiful bittersweet melodies. Mango Tree isn't the most obvious sounding Dead Cities track on first listen, although played alongside Her Face Forms in Summertime, Max and Through Your Gills I Breathe it makes much more sense. Overlaid with various environments, this is the edited arrangement used during the 96-97 tour, first heard on the 4th FM broadcast, including the tired and antique toy environments at the end. A fuller version would appear on the following from the Archives collection later in the year. The Teeth of the Wind. Named after the Exorcist 2 sample that preceded it on early transmissions, in a section that would end up becoming part of Dirty Shadows, The Teeth of the Wind is a Lifeforms era outtake that would never have fitted on that album. With a very dark atmosphere throughout, built around layers of synths and samples and a minimal drum beat, electronic hi-hats and a snare rimshot, the track's sinister, paranoid mood is closer to ISDN's vibe than anything else. First heard on the 4th Kiss FM transmission in 1993. Some of the synth sounds date back to 1984 from Brian's Z-Box track Deserve to Be Alive. The 2012 Enhanced Edition features a brief closing environment featuring a single ringing note and a field recording of what sounds like a city centre. Room 207. The title gives this one away immediately. Containing samples and rhythms from Room 208, this track likely originated in late 92 or early 93. It has a touch of the Fall to the Floor nature of Tales of Ephedrina, suggesting it's an earlier version of what became the final track. A bouncy mid-tempo techno beat with breakbeats and the lo-fi dial tone-esque sample from Room 208, the piece sadly doesn't develop too much over its 6 minutes, making it feel like an early demo that was scrapped rather than a full alternative take. Environments T1. A brief city field recording with a few samples and synth squelches over the top, this 93-94 environment is utilised as a proper linking section on the 2012 Enhanced version of the album. Insides, also known as Max Original. First heard as a live track with the working title Max Original, Insides is a beautiful piece of melodic down-tempo electronica with a subtle skittering beat, rich warm synths and of course Max's piano. The album version of Max is credited as being restructured and recollaged from MIDI files written by Max Richter, suggesting that the very different piano section here is based around Richter's original MIDI file before restructuring. If this is the case, it's a fascinating document that shows just how much work Brian and Gaz did on it to make it into the more concise and memorable piece of music on Dead Cities. Numerous samples are layered over the main sections, including synth sweeps and notes from various instruments. The piece appears to be taken directly from one of the 96 or 97 broadcasts. The 2012 enhanced version includes a brief outer environment of odd banging sounds. Latronic 1. A brief track based around an awkwardly staggered program beat, pensive chords and stabbing synth sounds. The wah sounds from the end of We Have Explosive Part 1 are also overlaid, as well as a Future Sound of London sting, suggesting that this is another that could have come from a live transmission. It's one of those intriguing sketches that feels like it could have been worked into a fascinating full-length track but ended up as a brief transmission piece. The 2012 enhanced version closed with a slowed down wah sample. Space Squid, also known as Space Squids. Where the hell did this track come from then? Originally Space Squid on the initial opening of FSOLDigital and Space Squids Forever After, it's a very fun track with a playful synth bass line and sax, slap bass and brass samples. The main melody being a synth, the samples being fairly straightforward notes and stabs, and the unvarying drum beat suggest it's probably from the Jumpin' and Pumpin' era, a track the label wouldn't have been particularly taken by. It's very silly but great fun to listen to, and clearly a favourite of the group, appearing on both the promotional archived EP and the From the Archives 2LP sampler. Stomach Acid, also known as Lifeforms Acid. Very briefly released as Lifeforms Acid on the launch of FSOLDigital and quickly renamed Stomach Acid, the era of this track is pretty obvious, with it first being heard on the final Kiss FM transmission and played regularly on the 3D Headspace tour. Squealing 303 lines, an Eastern sounding string melody, wordless vocal samples and a weird clumpy percussion loop form this really odd track, melodically quite unsettling and atmospherically bizarre. No one else could make a track like this. One of my favourite non-album 90s tracks. Dream Sequence 4, also known as Dream Sec 4. First released as Dream Sec 4 and later renamed, this brief track features heavily gated voice and percussion samples over which synth chords, field recordings and voices are played, giving it a confusing and hypnotic character. Little more than an environment itself, the gated elements of the track would later be vastly reworked into Environment's 3-track Surface Water. Made Contact Internal. With nearly 60 tracks to get through, the first 3 From the Archives albums were a lot to take in one day, and subsequently some tracks slipped through the cracks of memory. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a number of these seem to be at the end of the 3rd volume for me, such as this beautiful, subtle little piece which I only discovered how much I love very recently. Difficult to place, with Dead Cities-esque glitchy beats but layers of squelching noises more associated with 93-94 recordings, the real pull here is the quiet synth chords that run through much of the track, suggesting a serene evening outdoors. There are odds with the beat madness going on, but it manages to work somehow. One of those tracks I wish was much longer. A brief environment of backward sounds is added for the 2012 edition. Rotation. Much like Made Contact Internal before it, Rotation is a blissed out track hidden away near the end of From the Archives Volume 3 that I've sadly ignored over the years. Similarly beautiful synth chords give this track a sense of serenity, with a distorted synth melody and slowly rolling, heavily panned trip-hop breakbeat adding to the bittersweet feel. One of those tracks that's very hard to place era-wise, it could easily have come from the ISDN or Dead Cities sessions. Hardhead. Just when it starts to feel like a single coherent record, From the Archives Volume 3 throws a curveball with its final few tracks to remind you that it's effectively a disparate collection of odds and ends. Hardhead is an alternate version of Hardhead Frothin' at the Mouth mix, the first ever Future Sound of London release, recorded in 1990 and released in early 91 on the first Pulse EP. More stripped down with weirder samples and minus the main melody of that version, this is nevertheless from the same sessions, complete with rave whistles. The inclusion of a closing environment of reverse sounds on the 2012 Enhanced Edition ups the ridiculousness further. Poppadom. Following the 1990 track Hardhead comes Poppadom, a 1997 track from the first Isness sessions. A bigger contrast probably doesn't exist in the band's catalogue. An utterly bonkers track with layers of breakbeats, jazzy vibraphones, Hammond organs, orchestral timpani, Hawaiian guitar, and all sorts of odd swirling and bleeping samples. It's like a toy shop was thrown into a late 60s psychedelic movie and chopped up into a piece of electronic music. I have no idea how much my enjoyment of this track comes from it being part of a sadly lost potential site-leaning 98 FSOL record, but I just love it. Completely daft in a great way. The 2012 Enhanced Edition closes with totally out of place emotive synth chords. They don't even crossfade into the final track, instead fading to silence, making their appearance even stranger. LA7, one of 2 tracks to appear on the initial digital release of From the Archives Volume 3 and then disappear from all later versions. LA7 was first heard on 4th FM and Groove Radio transmissions during the Dead Cities tour, and this version is probably taken from the Groove Radio LA show, given its name and the stings and samples used over it. It ends rather abruptly, but it's fine because a much longer studio mix was included several years later as Honesty on Pulse 5. IA, also known as IAA. I can't believe I actually said that again. This track closes the standard release of From the Archives Volume 3 on its most bizarre note. Chopped up vocals saying I and yep, with pounding drums and acid squelches fed through cavernous delays. The rather crude nature of the track immediately suggests it's a very early piece. Then the heavy delays combined with the surprise reveal of Skinny Ribbed Fucker's recording date throw in some doubt. Could be 97? Ultimately, I have no idea. What I do know is that I absolutely do not like this track. It's the sound of a migraine that won't go away. The 2012 Enhanced Edition fades out, overlaid with Wet Pavement, played twice as a closing environment. Mulek Well. The second track removed from the Archives Volume 3 after its initial digital release, Mulek Well is an oddly lo-fi sounding piece built around a fast-paced breakbeat with various samples and effects laid over the top. It's hard to place an era really, but regardless of the year, it feels more like a quick studio jam rather than a finished polished track. Nevertheless, its rarity makes it an interesting curio in the band's catalogue, and it'll hopefully find a place on a full release one day. And on that note, I've spoken way too much about From the Archives. That's your lot for today. I'd love to hear your comments. I would love to know what you made of these 3 very controversial releases, probably the lowest rated FSOL releases in the group's catalogue, just down to their inconsistency, the gaps between the tracks. Were you there in March 2007 when all this got released? Did you find it as difficult to take it in one go as I did? Leave me a comment below, I'd love to hear from you. There are also like, subscribe, share buttons, you know the drill by now. And I'll be back next week with the remainder of the releases from the initial launch of FSOLDigital, and I really hope you'll join me then.